All right, somebody told me to listen for the ping, and I have to confess, having done this for a while, this was the first time I ever heard the ping, so I'm glad to hear it. You know, when I was here watching, and David Rubenstein marveled that there was a standing room crowd, but that was a discussion basically of how to get rich, which of course everyone wants to know. What I'm impressed by is that people want to know how to create great public infrastructure. So, you know who the two speakers are. Mark has written a wonderful book about why we are not able to get things done, why stuff doesn't get built anymore on the scale and speed that it used to. It's very much part of this whole debate about abundance that has been obsessing the country and particularly the Democratic Party. Vishaan is a brilliant architect, worked for Mike Bloomberg, who has one of the most compelling ideas for how to reimagine this central piece of infrastructure that we're going to talk about, and that has a decent chance of actually happening. So that's what we're going to talk about. Welcome, Vishaan.
Thank you.
Mark, thank you so much for doing this. Why don't you tell us first a little bit about Penn Station? Why is it important? Why was the old Penn Station so important? And why was it regarded as such a crime that it came down, that it triggered the landmarks preservation movement in the United States, the destruction of that one building?
This is a huge national embarrassment. Actually, if you could cue the slides, please, we can show you the embarrassment. So this is the original Penn Station. This is the Penn Station as it exists today. It handles about 2.5 times what the busiest airport in the world, Atlanta Hartsfield, handles. It's underground, it's unsafe, it's unworthy. And this is what it used to look like. Built in 1910, glorious building, had a famous kind of Roman bath as its inspiration, designed by McKim, Mead and White. With Eisenhower passes the Federal Highway Act, aviation takes hold, private sector owns the station goes bankrupt basically, and they tear down the station in the 1960s, and they replace it with the underground morass that we have today. And
am I right in remembering Vince Scully, the great architectural historian, said, we used to enter New York City like Roman gods. We now scurry in like rats.
That's right.
Right?
That's right, and we continue to scurry.
Keep going.
So, you know, this was obviously a very contentious time of Moses and Jacob's. I don't know, Mark, if you want to say anything about that.
Well, what I wanted Mark to tell us is, so we now saw what it became, and everyone agrees that this was a national embarrassment, both in terms of the destruction of the architecture, but also, as you say, unsafe, unsanitary, difficult to navigate, and it is the busiest transit hub in the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
I think 5, 6 governors have pledged that this is going to be the thing that they get done.
Yeah.
Why was it impossible to get it done, to do something to reimagine, re-architect Penn Station?
Well, when the original Penn Station comes down, it's in an era where it seems like the great men, the establishment of the time, have done terrible things sort of across the board. It's not just in great architecture and destroying a beautiful building like Penn Station, it's that they allowed cars to be produced that were unsafe at any speed, as Ralph Nader said. It's that they allowed DDT to be sprayed on crops, causing birth defects. It's that they sent us into Vietnam. It was the sort of sense that the establishment was bad and that they were making decisions now, like taking down Penn Station. And so the progressivism at the time thought to itself, it's time for us to put some guardrails around these folks. And so we have spent, as a movement, the progressive movement, democratic movement, center left to the very left, have spent the last 50, 60 years thinking, how can we put new barriers to prevent bad things from happening? Among them, how do we prevent people from destroying something like Penn Station? And those barriers are now so substantial and numerous that when someone like Vishaan comes with a plan to fix it, it's almost hard, if not impossible, to clear all the barriers that we ourselves have created.
And the barriers have been put in at almost every level, right? Like there's some national issues, there's some state issues, there's some local city issues.
Absolutely, and some of it's processes you have to do in the executive branch. Sometimes it's giving ordinary people the right to sue if they don't like a project. It's just, we could spend the next 4 or 5 hours just delineating all the different ways and how they interact. It is just a complete gauntlet to get anything done.
Now, Vishal, as somebody who has tried to build and tried to re-architect things, what has been your experience of how do you navigate this? How does anything ever, when you look at the list of things, you think to yourself, how does anything ever get built?
So, I mean, this has been an obsession of mine for 30 years. I am on governor number 5. I've watched hundreds of millions of dollars be spent. It's a poster child for democratic dysfunction. And so I think there are false debates about, well, I mean, I've had any number of elected officials say to me, the architecture doesn't matter. We just have to care about the rail operations, as if we could tear down Grand Central, put a CVS there, and run around like hamsters in a hammer trail underneath. And this is actually at the core of this scarcity idea that Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson talk about, that we have absorbed this idea that we, as the richest city and the richest country in the world, can't have both a beautiful station and great rail operations. Why? And so those debates, an extraordinary amount of fighting among jurisdictions, the different railways, governor, mayor, federal government, that nothing gets done. And so we have this problem constantly. Totally different project, an affordable housing project I'm working on. Motherhood and Apple Pie, houses formerly homeless people, got community buy-in in 18 months. It is taking 9 years to build because of environmental impact processes and different people's, this sense of deference in the democratic community that just leads to delay and dysfunction where no one seems to even care about the delay.
And it's very important for people to understand that when you talk about delay, especially along the 9-year delay, the costs completely spiral because now you're borrowing money for 9 years rather than borrowing money for 2 or 3 years.
Of course.
Can I take a quick addendum to what Vishal said? He says we can have a great station and a great railway. There are 3 reasons to do Penn Station, and they are all good reasons. One, to Vishal's primary point, is it's the greatest city in the world. It should have a front door that reflects that, and we don't have that now. 2, there aren't enough trains in and out of New York, and we need to expand the station. Totally separate issue than whether the entrance is grand. Third, you have a whole neighborhood around there that is sort of the frontier of New York. It's the West Side. It's where there hasn't been development. If Midtown is going to expand, it has to expand that way. That's a third reason. People who have interests, people who want more rail service, people who want a grand entrance, people who want a beautiful neighborhood, they have disparate interests. They're all reasonable interests, but they conflict with one another. And so Amtrak doesn't really care. They have limited money, and they don't really care what the station looks like because they're concerned about their tracks in the middle of Pennsylvania or whatever it is. The people in the neighborhood are sort of worried about who's going to move in. They're less interested in the station itself, but they want something that's going to spur development around. And then there are folks like Vishal and his peers who want something beautiful. And those things don't necessarily have to conflict, but in substance they do conflict. And there is no one to arbitrate between which of those different visions and to what degree are we going to do it? Are we going to sacrifice more train service so we can do a bigger train station? Because that is a trade-off we have to make.
So there was legendarily in New York one man who could cut through all of this, and it was Robert Moses.
Right.
And Moses essentially built out the infrastructure that makes New York a modern city, for better or worse. I would argue that you could not have New York as the international commercial financial hub it is without a lot of the things that Moses did. There were other things he did and proposed that were awful, but the reaction to him was to say, let's never have someone who has that much power again, and let's divide it up and give lots of people vetoes. Do you think that, in a sense, this is all the fault of one writer, Robert Caro, who painted a picture of Moses that has left people with such a sense of fear and dread of concentrating power in one person's hands?
Well, I mean, Caro, yes, but also Jane Jacobs, who wasn't actually a great transit advocate, has been weaponized, right? You know, Jane Jacobs, the famous community activist who fought Moses, defeated the Lower Manhattan Expressway, but
which was going to cut through Greenwich
right, which was
Village.
going to cut through Greenwich Village.
It's worth pointing out, you can see which side I'm on most of these debates. She was also totally opposed to Lincoln Center.
Right.
And fought it tooth and nail and lost that. And I think most New Yorkers would say, thank God she lost that.
The problem with that, along with fighting things like highways that shouldn't have been built, was fighting expertise. And it was really, in my mind, the death of expertise. You know, if you think forward to now where we live in a fact-free zone, it's kind of the beginning of that with Jacobs, at least in urban planning terms. And so, but I don't think we need to romanticize Robert Moses. I worked in the Bloomberg administration after 9/11. A very, very smart man named Dan Doctoroff, who was the deputy mayor, got an awful lot built under a democratic process, you know, the High Line and so forth. And we proved that if you built things really well, great design, great waterfronts, it built up the value of the city. The city's budget at 9/11 was $43 billion. They just passed one that's 137. That's because we grew the city, we grew the tech industry. And so these things do not have to be mutually exclusive and can have democratic process, but it has to be done with some sense of smartness. What I like to say is we have to be both inclusive and impatient. Right? We have to include voices, but be terribly impatient for why we're not getting things done more quickly in this country.
Well, you talk in your book about the cost, which is sort of stunning what it costs to build in New York City now. And I think the Second Avenue subway, and there's some other examples of 3, 4, 5 times as expensive as in Paris.
Yeah.
And you don't think of Paris as a place, you know, I mean, they protect workers and unionize workers and have lots of bureaucracy in France.
Yeah.
Why is it that it costs so much in New York?
It costs so much because in order to get an idea like Vachon's from the germ of a good idea to the end, you have to counter so much opposition. And there's no one to say, this is what we're going to do and we're going to move forward. The thing that Robert Moses had beyond power was discretion. He had discretion. People in the foreign policy establishment during his age had discretion. People in the economic realm, in every city there was sort of a group of city fathers who, mayors came and went, but the city fathers, if they wanted to build housing there, they were going to get it done.
You mean the sort of people deferred to authority?
Well, they deferred and there was no real check. There was no substantive check on them. If they wanted to do it, they could do it. It's sort of sheer political power.
Caro called them the permanent government of New York.
Right, right.
And then there was a cultural change in the 60s where progressives in particular look at these big city father figures and turn on them. They say, these guys don't have the public interest really in mind. Like you see in the 1968 Democratic National Convention, the old power brokers sitting inside the convention hall and Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and the Chicago 7 protesting outside. And their core message is you can't trust the power elite. And Robert Moses was the power elite in this situation. So my view is that you asked about Robert Caro, who wrote the sort of the takedown of Robert Moses, that Robert Caro is essentially Abby Hoffman in a tweed jacket. But he's taking the sort of ideas that are at the heart of the 60s, the counterculture, the anti-war, civil rights, the second wave feminism, taking that core idea of suspicion of centralized authority and saying it's respectable within the progressive tradition to take that to the hilt, and we have that the speaking truth to power became sort of the modus operandi of progressive politics for several years. And so we spent wherever we looked, whether it was in city development, in the development of rail transit, in the development of clean energy facilities, we were thinking, what can we do to make sure that the little people are protected against the monsters who would impose something terrible above them. So we took Robert Moses and his generations of discretion and replaced it with procedure, with this sort of fantasy that if we could just find a procedure, that everyone's voice would be included and then everyone would agree that this is the way forward. Well, it turns out that if someone proposes to build a high-speed rail through your own garage, like there's no, there's no conversation that's going to get you to agreement that that's a good idea. So you're going to oppose it, and unless you have some procedure that gives someone the discretion to say, look, I love this farm, I love this neighborhood, I understand that there's a orchid species that could be that could be rendered obsolete if we build this power line. I understand and there are real costs. I don't want to minimize that it's all just sort of a silly little flower. But there, towns, neighborhoods are going to be run over if we do there are big choices we're going to have to make, but we have not yet created a system where people have the discretion required to weigh the trade-offs and then push forward.
And when this happens, tell me if I'm wrong, Vishaan, but you build up a whole bunch of interest groups that then actually benefit from the complexity and the procedures. And I mean, think of, for example, there was a very interesting article about New York City's scaffolding.
Yes.
Right? I mean, for those of you who come to New York, those of you who live there, it is rather bizarre. It's the only city in the world where half the city is, at any given moment, covered with scaffolding. And it turns out that it's because of one law in the 1970s, very sad situation.
Right.
The cornice of a building fell off actually in my neighborhood and killed a Columbia student.
Right.
Terrible tragedy. But of course, the response is we will never let this happen again. And so now every building has to be inspected every 7 years or whatever it is. And the contractors know that you have to do this, so they extend what could be a 2-month process into a 2-year or 3-year process. In some cases, it's so expensive that they just put the scaffolding up permanently because that, makes sure that no corners. It feels like there must be so many special interests now that are wedded to this complicated process that we've built up.
Well, I think lawyers is another word for special interests. I mean, right there. So, Moynihan Station, which is the Amtrak station that got built next to Penn, took decades. I mean, Moynihan staff was in charge of it for a long time, and that was not a good thing. But part of it was just, I think there were 3 environmental impact statements. Now think about this. It's a train station, right? And so this is a field day for lawyers. It's a field day for the consultants who write this stuff. So yes, each of those rules has all of these unintended consequences that leads to special interest groups who profit from all of this delay.
So Mark, if you were to try to change this, and it feels to me like your book, it comes at a time where people are convinced increasingly, I bet you if we were to take a show of hands here, people are convinced that this is the right thing to do, but you now have embedded these 100 different processes, reviews, vetoes. How do you get around that?
Well, I think we've got these two extremes. One is Robert Moses with unfettered power, and one is the sort of diffusion of power so that anyone can stop anything. And between those two things are all sorts of mediums, right, where people could have a voice without a veto, so that you have some limited number of period where you can sue over a project, you have put a time clock on it, you create a process. Ultimately, I mean, I do want to point out there's the frequency with which we say, boy, this is really crazy. A lot of it is crazy, but to your point about the scaffolding, there was a reason, like a good reason, right? We don't want cornices falling off of buildings onto people, and so we created a solution to it. But that comes at a cost. You have to balance
trade-off. Yeah.
You have to have a trade-off, and we have yet to create, at least in the world of public infrastructure, in many cases in housing, certainly in clean energy, we've yet to create that process. I had a really interesting conversation yesterday with Sasha O'Connell, who used to work at the FBI and is now here at Aspen, talking about what happens when the national headquarters of the FBI wants to focus on, say, counterterror, but the special agent in charge of the field offices, they're on the verge of breaking a sex sting operation, right? And they have different priorities. How do you, those are both important issues. How do you resolve the tension there? And what they do is they've created a system in the FBI where they meet and they fight it out and they sort of argue it out. And then if they can't come to a conclusion, they can't find some consensus, the director decides how it's going to go. And we need something like that for a project like Vashon's. Or all of these projects where we have all the people who are going to be affected have a substantive voice in a way that Robert Moses didn't care to listen, but that nobody individually is able to say, well, I don't like this part of the project, therefore it's dead, and I'm going to sue into oblivion so that it never gets off the ground.
You were involved in several things that did get built, as you pointed
Yes.
out. The High Line, you've also watched as others. I don't know whether you were involved in LaGuardia as well. How did they get done?
Well, so, I mean, LaGuardia, rescuing us from the Dante's circles of hell, and I have to give Andrew Cuomo credit for that. He absolutely insisted on a different plan than what the government had intended. To Mark's point, he stepped in and said the original plan for fixing LaGuardia was wrong, and it should be a unitary terminal, which is what's out there today. But the other big thing is the way airline terminals get built today, and hopefully the way Penn Station will happen, is through now a public-private partnership, which is that a public developer comes in, becomes kind of the common enemy and the singular force that takes all of these squabbling airlines or railroads or whatever it is and says, this is the way to get this done, this is the financing plan, this is how we're going to take all of that on. That has not been present at Penn Station. I think now we have the opportunity for that. But you do need that singular force. And I think part of the problem that I've witnessed in democratic politics that wasn't true under Mike Bloomberg was there's so much deference to the council member down the hall and the borough president over here. And people didn't like this about Mike, but Mike would say, don't let the council members down the hall F this up, right? You had a certain timeline in front of you to get things done, because otherwise none of it would get done. And people didn't maybe like all of that at the time. But it wasn't Robert Moses. There was democratic process, but not so much that it stopped everything.
So if you were to, presumably the new next mayor of New York will be Zoran Mamdani. He says housing is his absolute priority. The most important way you can lower the price of anything is to increase the supply of it. What would you, given your book, if you were to be talking to him, what advice would you give him if housing is his key priority?
Yeah, well, to your point, it is to focus on supply in the first part. You hear Mamdani speak, and he's got some portions that sound like they would help us build more, and some portions that would make it sound like it would be a disincentive for a builder to actually invest in creating more stuff, because they'll live through these circles of hell, trying to get the approval and to try to figure out what the rent can be.
Well, and the rent freeze presumably is the thing that would disincentivize more building, right?
Correct. If the developers are looking to make a return on their investment, and if you limit the rent, now the housing market is very sophisticated, and there are people where if you build a lot of housing, it's not clear that the people in the lowest rungs of the socioeconomic ladder are going to be able to see those lower prices as quickly as we need them to. So you need to have some sort of complex mechanism whereby there are some protections for those on the margin.
But how would you increase supply in New York? How do you take some of those obstacles out of the way?
Well, the core of it is actually is to say, look, if you own this piece of property, the presumption is you should get to build on it what you want. And right now, what we've done for fear of Robert Moses or whatnot is to give the community just an excessive amount of opportunities to criticize, to change. We don't want so many floors. We don't want it to interrupt our view of the Verrazano Bridge. We don't want it to prevent us from this or that. We're not sure what the impact is going to be on the environment, as if another building in New York is going to somehow have some dramatic effect on climate. But people use absurd reasons, right. And so what you want to do is you want to return power in the first instance to the person who wants to do the building, so that they don't have to jump through so many hoops before there's actual construction.
So our firm did an analysis of all the empty sites available in New York. Near mass transit, out of the flood zone, found enough space for 1.3 million New Yorkers, 520,000 units of housing, most of that coming from mid-rise housing in the outer boroughs. The fact is, we then looked at those sites. Those sites have so much regulation that small builders, I'm not talking about big billionaire developers, small builders cannot afford to build them because of the amount of regulation. So Houston, which has no zoning and has been the punching bag of jokes for urban planners for years, has no homeless problem. or virtually little compared to San Francisco and Boston and New York, because we have so overregulated our housing market. And so Mr. Mamdani seems like a very smart guy. Hopefully he really listens to this, because I think the gut instinct for the progressive is to add more regulations and more programs, not less.
Have you sent him your plan?
People have.
All right, so now let's get to the good news, which is you have a plan for Penn Station. There are a bunch of plans, but I want you to go through yours just to demonstrate how this is actually doable.
So I'm going to, in the slides, skip through older plans. This is like one that didn't happen. This is another one that didn't happen. There's another one that didn't happen that when Mark and I first met. This is part of why it didn't happen. I mean, crazy, crazy stuff. This is important. 2017, right before the pandemic, 16 people were injured at a false event in Penn Station, right? And so that inspired me when we started our firm. We did this whole thing with the New York Times. If the garden moved, in fact, showed this to the governor's office at the time. The garden wanted to do this. This would have moved the garden to the back of the Farley building, and the governor's office didn't want to take the risk. So nothing happened, pandemic. And so a couple of years ago, a man named Peter Cipriano, who runs a company called Halmar here in the United States, made a kind of gesture to the garden that they could take out the theater, which is the blue box. It's a very, very large theater that sits inside of the garden and sits on top of this lovely space in the station with about a 10-foot ceiling height. Now, you don't have to be an architect to understand why a space like this is unsafe in the event of a fire, right, or a terrorist event, right? So when you take out the theater, you can go from this to this, with a 55-foot high ceiling and light coming through, and you understand where you're going. Our kind of conceit is to put the map of Manhattan on the ceiling as a coffered ceiling. And so that would then take the front of the building and transform it from this today, this architectural splendor, to something like that could look like this. And we're still in the middle of designing this. It's going to look even better than this. But we've been working with the garden. And so this would all be clad in stone. The garden would pay for their piece. This is another before and after that would go from this to this. Now, the way this can happen is the federal government announced a couple of months ago a full-scale takeover of the project, citing the fact that the local government has spent years dithering on this, spending hundreds of millions of dollars. I, for one, very much welcome it. Secretary Duffy stepped in, said, this is ridiculous. This is a federal facility because Amtrak owns it. We're going to take it over. Appointed a guy named Andy Byford, who's affectionately known as Train Daddy. Andy famously got Crossrail done in London, a fabulous project. And so he's been charged not with building the project, not with building this or another version of it, but to solicit developers to do a public-private partnership the way LaGuardia was done. So, you know, our team will put a bid in. There will be others. But this is the most hope I've had for Penn Station in 30 years, because, again, it is a slightly less deferential process. It's saying, we're the federal government. We're going to take this over. We're going to hire a developer who's going to knock everyone's head together. And then we're going to do this thing, which is going to be the most complicated piece of construction probably in North America that we've seen. Because again, a train comes in every 3 minutes. It's like doing open heart surgery while the patient's jogging. But LaGuardia was done that way.
And you've got basketball going on.
Right, and we've got basketball going on above. But LaGuardia was done that way, and you notice they never shut it down. It was this amazing active phasing. We think we can do the same, but really it comes from the leadership that says, you know, we're not going to defer to every last concern here. We've got to find compromises and make this thing work. And that's what's really coming from our federal government right now, and I, for one, am glad.
All right, so I want you to just go back in the slides, just for a little twinge of nostalgia. What was the original plan you had, where you were moving the garden?
So what?
That's
so this is in 2016. Our firm was quite young. So let me to explain this. So basically, again, Senator Moynihan had this plan to move, to move the train station into the post office that was built simultaneously with the train station.
Which is another grand
McKinney White building, although it's the only 20th century building I could find that had a moat built around it. And so because it was a postal building, And so it now serves as the Amtrak station. This was the original Moynihan plan. It was terribly over budget, again, run by the wrong people. And then there was a plan in the Spitzer era to move the garden into the back of that station, which is what you see there. It's what you see in the
Which
lower.
almost happened, if not for a...
Well, Governor Spitzer that March was actually in Washington for the train station during the day. He was there for a different reason that night. And that actually caused the collapse of this project. But there was a lot of fighting along the way. Mark likes to point out that the garden wanted that back wall torn down, and that's what all this fuss was. A group called the Municipal Art Society put a full-page ad in the New York Times, "Don't let it happen again," comparing that stupid brick wall that was a warehouse wall in the inside of this post office to the tearing down of the original Penn Station. It's nuts. Times editorial board was on our side. Anyway, none of that happened. The plan you're nostalgic about was, so as Moynihan was going forward for Amtrak, my big question was, you know, Amtrak's about 10% of the 650,000 people a day who use the station. So the remaining people, who are the actually people who have less money, who are the everyday commuters, what were they going to do? They're still in the old station. There was still this hope that the garden could move, and so my idea was to recycle the old garden so you didn't have to make new foundations and a new roof, and use it as a station pavilion. So that's the roof and the superstructure of the old garden reclad as the...
And now the ceiling height here is what?
And now the ceiling height here was about 115 feet.
Right.
And so you got quite this grand station, but the thing is, the governor at the time didn't want, this project was too complicated for him to take on. And so they were scared by it. And, you know, to be fair to the governors, why are they scared by these things? Because if they go wrong, or if they're a little over budget, you know, this is like the Obamacare website, right? Like, you know, we are so quick to criticize our elected officials the minute something goes wrong with a big idea, as opposed to saying, okay, these things are big and complicated. And so elected officials have fear. And so they don't go forward with things like this, which is why now there's this idea that by giving it to a public-private partner, you actually can de-risk it politically, and you can let that person take the hits.
So, Mark, does this look like it could happen?
I mean, from Vishan's microphone to God's ears, right?
Not the same thing?
Yeah. I mean, I love an ambitious a plan, and we've seen lots of them. You have the federal government take over. That doesn't mean that all the barriers that we have created to stop a public-private partnership or a government agency or a private developer doing something that people don't like aren't there. The Municipal Art Society may not like this. There may be an environmental issue. There may be that the neighborhood wants more housing and is worried about how rents will rise because there's a beautiful new facility. And so suddenly people will stream into the into Midtown West, and suddenly the people who are living there on a limited budget won't be able to afford their rent anymore. I mean, we saw what happened when Amazon tried to go to Queens. Was that generally, you had Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio, who hated each other, sitting at the table for a press conference, both embracing the project and the massive investment that was going to come in to that portion of Queens, and it was a single member of the New York State Senate who had the power to veto the program, and did, because he was afraid that he'd get primaried by people in the local neighborhood who didn't like the idea, and he had that power, and that power had devolved to him.
How had that power devolved to one person?
It had devolved to him because back in the 1970s, when New York was in a terrible place, it was because Rockefeller had been like Moses and been too powerful, and so he'd created something called the Public Authorities Control Board, which nobody knows anything about. And the Public Authorities Control Board basically gives members of the State Assembly and the State Senate a veto over any major distribution of state funding. And so it's what Shelley Silver used to kill a bunch of things, and to kill things that we don't even know about because people wouldn't even propose them if they knew he opposed them. And in the case of of Amazon and Queens, Mike Gianaris was a local state assemblyman or state senator, and he was the one who sat on the Public Authority Control Board. So if he voted against it, the thing was dead. And when Amazon caught word that he was probably going to vote no, they pulled out, and all the money went to Washington. That's one example of dozens and dozens. This is the pattern that we progressives have not caught on to. We were the ones that created big, powerful government institutions. For the beginning of the movement in the 1890s or earlier through the 1960s, we were the ones who wanted to do big things. We built the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Marshall Plan, and you name it. The name of our game was empower true experts to do big things that we can't do individually. And then all of these things happened. Vietnam, Watergate, Penn Station comes down, DDT. You can go through the list of things that riled progressive up so that the zeitgeist within the movement changed so that we were, in all cases, eager to stop bad things from happening. And the bigger than any single thing that a czar could do or what piece of legislation you could do to change this old regulation or limit this one, we as a movement need to rethink how we're going to balance this impulse to push power up into institutions that can do big things that we can't do on our own, and this simultaneous desire to stop little people from being coerced and bulldozed by the powers that be.
So this is what we centrists howl about constantly. I mean, so there's another famous example, which is we were going to depress the entire West Side Highway in Manhattan. We had federal funding for it, and the environmental impact.
And explain, so the idea was you take the entire West Side Highway, put it underground the way you have lots of Paris has those underground.
And create a beautiful park. Madrid just did
which
this.
would connect New York
Yes.
to the water, to the Hudson River.
So
for
Madrid
the
just
time.
did this,
Yeah.
Dallas just did this, right? So we're going to have this beautiful park on the West Side Highway. The environmental impact statement did not properly expose that there was a mating ground for striped bass, a mating ground, not like the only mating ground, to which Ed Koch famously said, let them go to a motel in Jersey like everyone else. right? I mean, this is not a new problem, right? Right? And so, I mean, I do think it's important to make some political distinctions here because it has become an enormous problem for progressives to the point where I cannot identify as one, because we have to build things. We have an extraordinary housing crisis. So Mr. Mamdani is winning on an affordability agenda. Why has the city become so unaffordable? Because it's impossible to build supply, right? That is why, and that built up under Mayor de Blasio. And undoing that is going to take a decade. It's not going to take some magic trick where you freeze the rent. It has to do.
In fact, de Blasio froze the rent 3 times, which many
and the
people
housing crisis got
think
worse
that's
and
what
worse
that's
and
what
worse.
caused it. Yeah.
Right. And so, look, the examples are all over the place. The cities in the red states do not have this problem, right? And so we have to confront the fact that the politics of this has to change in our cities. I mean, New York is it has a GDP roughly the size of South Korea, and it's run like North Korea.
All right, we will take questions on that note. Sir.
Why not get rid of zoning? Like, why couldn't there be federal legislation to dramatically limit the power of local municipalities to regulate land?
Is that feasible? I mean, why don't you take that, Mark?
I mean, that would be a revolution, right? Like, state and localities have forever believed that it was their role to be able to determine what was going to be built in their municipality. I think that Donald Trump wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal before his election loss in 2020, in 2020, arguing that he was going to save the suburbs. So the notion that we should be able to have people build where they want to build as they like is fine. The zoning came about in the early days, sometimes for nefarious purposes, but also because, like, if you have a children's school, you don't want a coal processing facility right next to it, right? Like, there are things that we probably don't want to get rid of wholly. And I'm not sure that as a political matter, you may not be a progressive, I still consider myself a progressive and believe that building big things is a progressive thing that we need to reconnect with. The the notion that you would give the people who live nearby no opportunity to voice their concerns at all, give them no opportunity, I think is a bridge too far. We've seen this happen in New York. Like in the 70s, there was a guy who was sort of named Ed Logue. There's a terrific Elizabeth Cohen book about his life where he was sort of foisted on New York State as a good guy's Robert Moses, and he was going to build housing everywhere, and he proposed to build some multifamily housing in Westchester County, and he needed a police escort in order to get to a community meeting there. People were outraged at the notion that, in these Tony leafy suburbs. Now, that's the high end. People object to more housing. At the low end as well, people who live in neighborhoods that have affordable rents are very nervous about gentrifications, so they object. So people want to have some element of control over over the neighborhood that they live in. It's too much control now. We've overcorrected for the sort of notion that there would be these big developers who would come in and completely disrupt the world that you or I inhabited. But we can't go back to that world, right? But we need to find some place where people have a voice without a veto.
So I'd love to see some women. Yeah, I see. Next.
Good to do the balance.
Let's let him go because he had started, and then you, ma'am.
Okay, great. We've talked a lot about New York City. I'm from Boston. To widen the frame a little bit, the idea that America doesn't build anything, I think is a little overstated. We build, over the last couple of decades, we have built a lot of oil pipelines. We built a lot of natural gas pipelines. There are highway projects, urban highway projects that are happening now that would have made Robert Moses very, very proud, with residential dislocations, with significant impacts on the environment. To people like me, that is concerning. And so if we live in a world in which, and I'm putting forward the proposition, and you don't have to agree with it, that it is too hard to build some things and too easy perhaps to build others. How do we find that balance, and what standards do we use to judge which is which?
Yeah. So, I'm from Providence. You're from Boston, so we live in the same neighborhood. A classic story here, from my point of view, is that Massachusetts in 2016 passed a law trying to green the Massachusetts grid with clean power, replace fossil fuels. Seemed like a great idea. Charlie Baker signed it in the sunshine outside on Beacon Hill. And basically half the project was to get hydropower, clean hydropower from Quebec into the Massachusetts grid. But of course, Massachusetts does not abut Canada, so you had to find some way to build a high voltage transmission line through one of the intervening states, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. We are now almost 10 years on, and it hasn't happened. And it's one of the stories in my book is just the unbelievable gauntlet that the people who wanted to build this transmission line wanted to build, and the local communities worried about literally about orchids, and people worried about, were you going to build a wire that could be seen from the Appalachian Trail, right? As if those sorts of concerns would overwhelm the desire to take 700,000 gasoline-burning cars off the street, which was that's the rough equivalent if you had gotten this clean power. It still hasn't happened. It's been 10 years. You're right, it is easier to build a pipeline than it is to build a transmission line. It's maybe in some cases too easy to build a pipeline and too hard to build a transmission line, and we should find some way to find a happy medium where all the people who object to a transmission line for any variety of scurrilous reasons or legitimate reasons that their concerns are incorporated, but that eventually the project is built.
I just want to add, though, the reason it's hard to build some things and easier to build others is because it's hard to build where there's power structure. Jane Jacobs stopped Robert Moses from building the Lower Manhattan Expressway because she was a wealthy white woman in a wealthy white part of the city. Right before, Robert Moses had built the Cross Bronx Expressway through a largely, African American, Jewish American, and Latino American community, and no one said anything. Right? And this is still happening today. It's all about where the power is.
I would also add, I think you would agree that the issue is whether or not you should build oil pipelines. If you decide to build them, we should build them fast. And what has often happened is, because you don't want to confront the issue directly of do we want to build, you kill it by putting in lots of procedural reviews rather than killing it at the start and saying, no, actually we want solar energy, we don't want this, something. Ma'am.
I'm wondering about Hudson Yards in New York. That's certainly sizable. How did it happen? Is it a good thing for New York?
All right, this is Hudson Yards in New York. We're getting a little parochial, particularly for those of us at CNN, because that is where I work. I will reserve judgment on it, other than to say to you, if you haven't been to Dubai, don't bother, just come to Hudson Yards. It's one big mall.
So I'm not going to defend the architecture, but the growth was very important for the city. It helped pay for a subway extension. Again, I mean, as an architect, I'd like to see much better architecture happen, but I do think our city, we have so many needs that we have to grow the city in order to grow the tax base to pay for the schools and the parks and the affordable housing and all the things that the city needs. And so it has been beneficial in terms of that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, there's an engineering marvel. The buildings have no foundation, right?
Right, it's sitting over rail tracks.
Right.
It's a far more complex thing to build than most buildings.
Yeah,
So, but that's a very efficient private sector doing what it does, which is make money.
So, and if you can just keep your questions short, which all of you are doing, but that will get us to get a few more in.
Visham, most New Yorkers don't know your name, and yet your life's work is about to transform our lives. How did you keep this commitment going for 30 years in the face of no, no, and no?
I'll try to keep this response quick. I actually think that I am blessed to be part of a city where people deeply, deeply care about I watch people from wealthy families do public service. It is a very, I lived in California during the pandemic. I was the dean at Berkeley, which is the largest architecture school in California. San Francisco's in crisis, LA's in crisis. My phone never rung. Like, there was no sort of network, or it feels like a social archipelago, whereas New York is this place that has this culture of people who I think really care, and I'm one of those very, very dedicated people who want to leave a better city to my children and grandchildren than what I inherited.
So, and then Dale, you get the last word.
Well, as someone who grew up in the West Village Meatpacking District, thank you for the impact that you've had on my life and my upbringing. To piggyback off that following question, are there any reasons for belief or for optimism in New York that things are changing? And what can New Yorkers do to be a part of driving forward that change?
Again,
yeah, you take it. And I should say, I know we're talking a lot about New York, but I think I can't remember, somebody said everybody in America lives in the city or place they live in and is also a citizen of New York City. So everyone is allowed to have opinions.
well, let me try to broaden the answer. I mean, I do think we have to fight for more housing, more transit, more social good. I would just also say that, if you think about the topic we've talked about this afternoon, I think about all the crises you cover on your show, what we talk about at this festival, climate change, AI, global conflict, all the things we're trying to solve. What are we solving for? Right? If we can solve all those things, what are we solving for? And to me, it is solving for the beauty of a collective physical culture, as opposed to the corrosion of our lonely digital culture. And so to me, fighting for not just New York, but every city, every community, big and small, and making the physical culture better is what lets us see each other eyeball to eyeball and lets us have social cohesion when we've got digital algorithms trying to pull us apart.
But to answer his question quickly, how can he make both of your jobs easier?
Fight for council people who fight for housing as opposed to stopping housing. Fight for policies that look for what results, not just what gets stopped.
This conversation wasn't happening a year ago. This is a conversation, Derek and Ezra Klein's book, Abundance, Yoni Applebaum, How to Book, Stuck, my book, we've got, Fareed had us all on his show. There's a group of people and a growing movement. You sometimes call it people like progressivism that builds, some people call it abundance. There's a whole series of things, state capacity. There are a bunch of buzzwords that were not in the lexicon a year ago. And I'm hopeful that this panel and people here are seeing that there is this tension that we as progressives have not been self-aware about whether we want to push power up or push it down. And once you have that paradigm in your mind, once you realize that in certain cases we do want to protect women and their right to do what they want with their own bodies, and we want to build up institutions that are powerful enough to stop climate emissions, right? So those are those push in different directions. And for the first time, in a long time, progressivism is having an internal dialogue about how we balance those things. I think that's a real source of optimism.
Final question, Dale.
Actually, I'm just going to close by saying thank you. I think you guys are fantastic. My daughter works on housing in New York. I hear this all the time. I will say your next book should be about progressive places that are building housing. One of them is Denver and Boulder, where I live. A lot of housing. Yeah. So something's weird about New York and the political vetoes.
Well,
and San Francisco probably too. But it's not throughout the entire
that's
blue
fair.
states.
No, it's very fair.
And I think we need to get some more examples.
Well, maybe we can get a movement started that about 10 minutes from here, not right here, but 10 minutes from here, maybe you could build 20 buildings that are 10 stories high so that people who work for all of you don't have to commute 1.5 hours every day.
Thank you very much.